In this lesson, we're actually going to go into a MDS 9216i switch, which is a MDS fiber channel switch, and we're going to perform our initial setup. And in this lesson, you're going to see that the commands that we do are going to be very similar to what we do on a Nexus switch because it is basically running NXOS. So we're going to go through the switch setup procedure. We're going to do things like setting the admin password, configuring the management interface address, going to have the opportunity to set the switch name as well as defaults on the switch, such as storage-specific defaults like vSAN membership and default zoning policies. We're going to save those configurations, and then we're going to take a look around the operating system, and we're going to be able to do things similar to what we did in NXOS, such as set the banner message of the day, and show the startup config and the running config, go into config T, maybe do show interfaces brief. We're going to do a couple different show commands, and that should wrap up our lesson. So let's go ahead and go to our terminal emulation program. In this case, it is a program called Secure CRT. If you watched our previous lessons, what we did in this scenario is we actually connected to the switch, and because my switch is already configured, I already have an IP address assigned, I was able to connect over the IP network. If it's a new switch coming out of a box, you would have to use a terminal cable or a console cable over a serial port on your laptop. So I'm going to go ahead and start the setup routine. Like I said, this one's already configured, so normally when you powered it up, it would automatically go into the setup configuration. I'm going to say yes, that I would like to do that. And the first thing it's going to ask me normally is to set the admin password. In this case, there's already an admin password set, so it's not going to ask me to set the admin password. It is going to ask me if I want to enforce my secure password standard, and because this is a lab switch, I'm going to say no. But if you were in a normal production environment, I would highly recommend to use secure passwords. It is also asking me if I'd like to create another login account because my admin account is already configured, to which I'm going to say no. Now, one of the first options, similar to any other NXOS switch, is going to be your SNMP community string. Now, your simple network management protocol string is something that you use to manage the switch via a remote management program like a SolarWinds or a Cisco Works or a Cisco Prime Data Center Network Manager, those types of programs. And usually there's two different strings you can set. There's a read-only string, which I'm not going to set right now. That allows you to see information but not make any changes. And then there's a read-write string, and you can have those set independently of each other, so some folks can have read-write access and some people can only read from the device. I'm going to not configure either of those. I am going to set my switch name to MDS 9216, and then it's going to ask me if I want to configure my out-of-band management. Now, all of the out-of-band management for this device will actually go through the Management 0 interface. If I want to communicate with this device, everything will happen over that Management 0 interface. And in this case, I do want to configure it. I'm going to go ahead and give it a fake IP address of 1.1.1.1. I'm going to set my net mask for my network here to 255.255.255.0. I can go ahead and configure my default gateway so that this can talk out to the rest of the world, and configure it as 1.1.1.254. Now at this point I could go in and configure some of the advanced TCP/IP options, such as in-band management. I have not seen in-band management used very often. We usually rely on the out-of-band management, so in this case I'm going to say no. And it allows you to actually communicate with IP encapsulated in fiber channel over the fiber channel network over the default of vSAN 1. Now it's asking me how I'd like to be able to connect to the switch, and the way I'd like to be able to connect to the switch in most cases is through SSH. It's a very secure way to do that, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I need to generate a key for that. I'm going to pick the default, which is RSA and 1024. And then it's asking me if I'd like to enable the Telnet service. And Telnet service is another way that I can connect to the switch. It's less secure and by default is turned off on the NXOS operating system. So I'm going to go ahead and say no because I'd like my communications to be secure. I also have the ability to turn on what we would call a web server, and this web server allows us to manage the MDS switch through a GUI, and in a lot of cases that's the way that SAN administrators are used to managing their SAN environments. So I definitely recommend to keep that on and investigate those tools at a later date. We can configure the clock. In this case I'm going to say no. I can also configure my time zone. I can configure daylight savings time, and then I can also set this to a NTP server or a network time protocol server where I can, instead of individually setting the time on each one of these devices, I can actually pull the time from a centralized resource. In this case I'm going to say no. Now it's asking me what I'd like my default switch interface state to be, whether they're shut down by default or whether they're up by default. In this case, I'm going to say that I'd like them to be down. There are also default switch port modes, and in this case the default is for the switch port to be in trunking mode, so that if on the other side it's also in trunking mode, they will automatically set a trunk up between two of the switches in a fiber channel network. So I'm going to leave that default. It's also asking me what the default type of switch port I would like to be, and in this case it's asking me if I should configure the default switch port as an F port or a fabric port. And what this is saying is basically the majority of the devices that are going to be attached to this switch would be nodes or servers and storage. And in some cases that can be a good thing to turn on, for instance, for a edge switch versus a core switch. But in this case I'm going to leave the default to no. We also have the ability to configure the default zoning policy. Now, zones are much like access lists, and they're a way to enforce security on our fiber channel environment. And by default, we can either allow all the traffic, so permit everything, or we can deny everything by default, which is the standard. So anytime we have members of the zone, they will not be able to talk to each other by default unless you explicitly say that they can. In this case, I'm going to leave the default, which is deny. And then this next command is asking me how I'd like to distribute my zoning or security information, and I'm going to leave that to no by default. And finally, it's asking me how I'd like to configure my default zone mode. In a later lesson, we'll kind of discuss the merits of basic zoning versus enhanced zoning, but by default, basic zoning is enabled. Now, after I'm done entering in all my information, it's asking me if I'd like to go back and change anything. In this case, I would say no, because I'm sure that I got everything right. And finally, it's asking me if I would like to save it. If this is the first time I was setting up this switch, I would go ahead and say yes here. It would save my changes and allow me to configure the switch. Because the switch is already configured, I'm going to go ahead and say no, and it's going to exit back out into the prompt of the switch, where we can go ahead and take a look and see what a fiber channel switch is all about. So from here, it looks very similar to my Nexus switches. I can't really tell that this is a MDS fiber channel only switch, and if I was to do things like show version, I would see similar things to what I see when I do a show version on a Nexus switch. I can see the operating system version. The only thing different here is that I can actually see that this boot flash configuration says M9200, which stands for an MDS 9200. I can also see that the hardware specifically calls out that it is an MDS 9216i switch. Now, if I want to make changes to this switch, just like any other Nexus switch, I'm going to have to go ahead and go into Configure Terminal. Now I'm in a mode in the operating system where I can actually start to make changes to it. And something that I normally want to do to a Nexus switch is I want to go ahead and put a banner in so that if somebody logs into the switch, they see a message saying, for instance, you must be a member of this company in order to administer the switch. If you're not, please log out. So I'm going to configure a banner or message of the day, and I'm going to go ahead and put something like hello in there and then press enter. Now you'll notice the $ I use, those are my delimiting characters. Those actually tell me when the message starts and stops. So I put it in there at the start, and then I type my message, and then I end it with that same character and press enter, and I'm all set and ready to go. So these are similar commands that we do on a Nexus device. Another one that is interesting and really going to show a difference between an MDS switch and a Nexus switch would be my show interface brief. So for instance, when I do a show interface brief on a Nexus 5000 switch versus an MDS switch, in most cases I'll see Ethernet interfaces on my Nexus switch. In this case, you can see that this device only has fiber channel interfaces. And I guess you could see that on a Nexus 5000 if you turned all the interfaces on a unified port configuration to fiber channel, but you will see that on a MDS switch, which is what we're seeing here. So that's a main difference. I can also see that just like on my Nexus switch, I have a management 0, and that's where all that out-of-band communication is going to go through, as well as the fact that I can see that I have 2 gigabit Ethernet interfaces on this device, and we covered fiber channel over IP in other lessons, and that's what those gigabit Ethernet interface 1/1 and 1/2 are used for. There are other show commands that I might want to do inside of a MDS switch, such as show running config. This is going to show the config that is up and running currently on the device, and it's going to look similar to what you'd see on another NXOS device, but in this case we're going to have some new and interesting things like vSANs, which are virtual SANs, much like VLANs in the networking world. And here I can see in my vSAN database I have 2 configured. I can also see that I've got different interfaces here. Like I mentioned, your fiber channel interfaces. If I had configurations on those fiber channel interfaces, you would see it here. And then there's my zoning config. And my zoning config, once again, controls what devices can talk to what other devices on a fiber channel network, much like an access list on a Ethernet network. That was my running config. If I wanted to show a startup configuration, I would do similar to what I do on any other Nexus device and do a show startup config. Now I can see when this device gets turned off and then turned back on, this is the config that's going to come up. So if I don't save my running config to my startup config after I make changes, those changes are going to basically be null and void, and when I reboot this device, it's actually going to come up with the startup config, not that original running config, unless I do something called a copy run start or a copy running config to startup config. Now when I do that, it actually saves the changes from my running config to my startup config. So I want to make sure that I do that often after I make changes to my Nexus operating system devices. So thank you for joining me for this lesson. As you can see, we're just getting started with the MDS configuration. It's very similar and it should feel like home after configuring some Nexus devices. There are some differences with your fiber channel interfaces and your vSAN database and your zone sets, but we're going to go through all those. So please join me for the next lesson, configuring vSANs.